Well, welcome to the second of our 2009 Darwin College Lecture Series on the theme of Darwin. I guess is predictable, this series is proving very popular. And I was very sad that last week we had to turn away 200 people because the overflow overflowed. It's always been very important to the college not to have any financial charge for these lectures. And the generosity of our benefactors, Richard and Anne King, has enabled us to carry on doing this. The problem, of course, is it means that you have to arrive tediously early to be sure of getting a seat. So, we're grateful for your patience, and we offer our apologies for the inconvenience, particularly people who are turned away. The compensation is that now they can get us on iTunes U in due course, as well as iPods and old technology, Cambridge University Press later in the year. But to business. Last week we had a wonderful lecture by Sean Carroll, which in a sense started at the end of the story with his account of the present frontiers of evolutionary development science from his genetic background. Now we're going right back to the start, or indeed I think perhaps a little before the start. How did Charles Darwin's ideas emerge, and how have they been interpreted? When thinking about a speaker for this subject, we only had one choice. Janet Browne is the biographer of Darwin. She started by studying zoology at Trinity College Dublin and went on to do her doctorate at Imperial College in the History of Science. She worked for many years at University College London, and in 2006 went to be Professor of History of Science at Harvard. Her 2-volume biography of Charles Darwin, published in 1995 and 2002, has met widespread acclaim and many prizes and the rest of it. We couldn't have anyone better to talk about Darwin's intellectual development. It's a pleasure to introduce Janet Browne.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a wonderful pleasure to see you all here tonight, and I can see lots of old friends in the audience, so it's just so nice. Thank you all for coming. I am very delighted to be here in the professional sense too, of course, and to be able to express in person my appreciation to the Master and to the Fellows of Darwin College for their invitation. As one of many people who study Darwin, and we've got a number of us here in the audience tonight, it's very special to participate in this series of lectures exploring his legacy. And I should say it's also a great personal pleasure to stay in the college where I've been last night and tonight, formerly the home of George Darwin, and it's full of appropriately historic atmosphere. You can't imagine what a treat it is to take your morning cup of tea with an oil painting of Darwin on the wall beside you. So I thank you very much for your hospitality. And I'd like to begin with a photograph taken in the 1970s, black and white, conventional photograph, which purports to show Darwin's ghost. The house and garden aren't Darwin's property, but a neighboring mansion in the village of Down in Kent. And according to the photographer, who was a valid ghost buster, he can be seen here in his hat and cloak, with his walking stick and his telltale beard. So I've looked and looked, and looked, and I've shown this to a number of Harvard students who one likes to think are absolutely on the ball, and none of us can see anything, except possibly something going on here on the left. Down here has often generated comment, whether this is a bent-over figure with a bit of beard, maybe his hands, and some legs. But we're always distracted by these other objects. Is this a walking stick? So the whole thing, I mean, not to be construed as a literal investigation, but as a metaphor to introduce the way to introduce the topic of biography and some of the responses that people have had to Darwin. Because even if there is a ghost in this image, it's the way that we as an audience approach that material that concerns me. It's the ghosts and the afterlives of Darwin that I wanted to talk about tonight. So my aim is to use this as a metaphor for the biographical process, because biographers are in the business of capturing ghosts, of creating characters, even if they can't be seen in the evidence before us, choosing the words, arranging the documents to bring people alive again. And of course, biographers have to work within the written record. Yet, like actors, writers do need to interpret and to create their character. The books that biographers build are necessarily created worlds, and the characters or the personalities of the people we write about can be presented in a number of ways. They can be made to say a number of things. And my special theme tonight is to look at Darwin's intellectual development as a number of scholars and biographers have discussed it in the past. And I would like to say that this is a topic, Darwin's own intellectual development is a topic on which he himself was notoriously reticent, hardly offering any introspective reflections about himself in his autobiography, even though he called it Recollections of the Development of My Mind and Character. And Darwin was at all times a very engagingly modest man, and in those recollections was rather wonderfully unable to find in himself anything particularly special or unusual. He paints himself as a very ordinary young man. And this leaves the field ripe for a great deal of speculation by historians about his character. Tonight, since we're in commemorative mode, I'm going to follow those speculations through the decades since his death, and at the same time, ask what functions those speculations might have served and what messages about science they might be presenting. Now, the afterlives of science, of a scientist, are usually much more revealing than that ghostly picture. Galileo has his glittering tribunal in Florence, as represented here. Newton, his monumental statue by Roubiliac. Edward Jenner, the pioneer of vaccination, had at one point a very elaborate museum at the former Wellcome Historical Museum in London. Claude Bernard, the physiologist, has his chateau in the Rhone region, in the Rhone Valley. And Einstein has his T-shirt. And from very early days, commemorative objects of one kind or another have been produced to impress people with the desired values of the age, and Darwin was no exception. There were numerous artworks, ceremonies, statues, books, portraits, and memorabilia of various kinds that consolidated his memory. And Darwin was, of course, known, both in his own time and to those generations that followed, particularly to us, through his portraits, this very lovely early watercolor by George Richmond that just was taken actually as a marriage portrait, although we tend to use it and think of it as a portrait that accompanied the Beagle voyage, because the date is just 3 or 4 years after he returned back from the Beagle voyage. It's one of the earliest images of Darwin. So from the earliest images of Darwin through to the last images of Darwin, this wonderful portrait by John Collier, who was Thomas Henry Huxley's son-in-law, come to represent Darwin in a visual way to people after him. I was very glad, I must say, to see the William Walter Ullis portrait of Darwin in Darwin College this afternoon. There were portraits, there were statues, wonderful statue by Joseph Boehm in the Natural History Museum. There were cartoons, endless cartoons, and many forms of memorabilia that commented on the points that the public felt were at issue after the publication of The Origin of Species. Always the question of ape ancestry, always the question of where was God in our world after Darwin's writings. And this is a contemporary statuette that brings these kinds of issues to the fore. The chimp is reflecting on a human skull with the calipers of time in his feet, or her feet. And many other forms of memorabilia. And the party of Darwinists I was out with last night were carefully looking for this, but we didn't manage to find it. So you'll notice this is a full bottle. We've been trying to find a copy of that. So there's a number of ways of commemorating Darwin, and he has become a very significant element in the way we think about science today. I'm just going to turn this off for a moment. And like Newton, Galileo, Marie Curie, Louis Pasteur, a number of noted scientists, there's a good few shelves of biographies as well. Depending on how they're defined, there were 5 or 6 biographies of Darwin published in English soon after his death in 1882. Then there were a flurry of 15 or more in the 1930s, followed by a lull until a cascade of writings in 1959, marked the year that marked the centenary of The Origin of Species and the 150th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And today, 50 years further on, 2009, a big commemorative year, there have been 6 more Darwin biographies, not counting the ones for children, 4 Wallaces, and a big 2-volume Huxley, as well as a stream of modern commentaries and discussions. And in all, the genre actually isn't all that large. There are 30 or 35 books that we can call mainline biographies, yet there are some 2,000 or 3,000 other books, other written forms of analysis of Darwin's achievement, Darwin's life, Darwin's legacy, in English alone, published since 1882. Now, clearly, Darwin is and remains a highly significant cultural figure. And the editorial of last week's Nature magazine suggests that Darwin was arguably the most influential scientist of modern times. No single researcher, Nature says, has matched his collective impact on the natural and social sciences, on politics, religion and philosophy, on art and cultural relations. And this is a large claim, but I think it's a true one. If nothing else, this activity, these 2,000 to 3,000 volumes, suggests that publishers, rightly or wrongly, take Darwin and Darwin-related matters as a highly marketable proposition. And the most enduring question that all these books address in one way or another is, how did Darwin become the man who wrote The Origin of Species? How did he change from an enthusiastic but relatively unambitious amateur naturalist into one of the greatest biological thinkers and authors of the modern era? And Darwin had relatively little to tell us about this, about his own mental development. He acknowledged his early love for natural history and his passion for collecting natural history specimens, which in later life he came to understand as an urge that could have been satisfied by collecting anything, either even postage stamps or biscuits, as he says. Yet he was well aware that his delight in collecting mineralogical specimens as a boy in Shrewsbury and his pleasure in beetle collecting whilst he was at university in Cambridge were a key part of his youth. And his recollection was that his time at Edinburgh and Cambridge universities was actually wasted as far as the curriculum went. Now, of course, we in the modern era can add a great deal more to this story, and we take a much more sophisticated view of the young undergraduate than Darwin did. Yet this image of carefree innocence was important to Darwin himself. He wanted to tell his story in a particular way. He always believed, as indeed we do today, that the Beagle voyage was the turning point of his life. It was the voyage that made him what he became, and as he said in his recollections, the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most event in my life and has determined my whole career. And here is an image, very well known nowadays, but we must remember it wasn't well known in the 19th century. This is the Beagle in Sydney Harbour, painted after Darwin's voyage. It was painted on the third Beagle voyage by, I can't remember who painted it, but it's a wonderful image, possibly it's Conrad Martin's, a wonderful image that has become part of our consciousness, although not of the individuals living in the 19th century. And when Darwin said that the voyage was the most important event in his career, he spoke truly. There were a number of things he afterwards singled out, and I just wanted to run through these because they're not quite the same things that we single out. They coincide, but not all the things that we single out are in Darwin's list. Darwin spoke very warmly of the role that Charles Lyell's book on the principles of geology played in the development of his scientific ideas. It accompanied him on the Beagle voyage, and it provided not only information against which to gauge his own observations and his developing theories, but it also provided him with a methodology that centered on the slow and persistent accumulation of many small changes that add up to large effects, which in Lyell's hands was a pioneering geological method, but in Darwin's mind became also a way of thought that could be applied to the whole of the natural world, which became the keystone of his scientific approach. The impact of Lyell on Darwin's mind and character can hardly be overstated, and Darwin himself said, "I've always thought that the great merit of the principles was that it altered the whole tone of one's mind, and therefore that when seeing a thing never seen by Lyell, as Darwin did in South America, one yet saw it partially through his eyes." And this acknowledgement was one that lasted for the whole of Darwin's life. He came back from the Beagle voyage as a devoted Lyellian, and indeed was Lyell's only disciple at that time. So the two met very rapidly on his return and became the closest of friends for the rest of their lives. Darwin also spoke very warmly of the impact of visiting the Galapagos archipelago, a visit that destabilized his impressions of the fixity of species. And that's all he says about it. And of his adventures in South America. And this isn't an image of Darwin, but it represents very much his sense of adventure and the spirit of amusement that accompanied many of his gallops across the pampas in search of animals and plants. So he speaks of his adventures on the pampas, of collecting fossils, of visiting Tierra del Fuego, seeing the stars from on top of the Andes. He experienced an earthquake and saw a volcano erupt, two astonishing examples of geology at work that similarly destabilized his ideas about the permanence of the earth. And he lastly spoke very warmly about the experience of seeing indigenous peoples in their own lands, in their native countries. In particular, the shock of seeing the inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, for whom who for Darwin appeared as savages almost on the edge of barbarity. And the shock was deepened by the fact that the Beagle carried 3 members of the Shamana tribe who had been to England with Captain Fitzroy for 3 years and had acquired all the attributes of civilized people. Darwin liked these 3 anglicized Fuegians who were on the boat, who were on the ship, and could not help but compare them with their literal relatives on the shore, contemplating the transient nature of civilization and the unity that he was beginning to feel underlay all varieties of mankind. So these experiences, and many others, made an indelible impression. Darwin always believed that the Beagle voyage was the most extraordinary event in his life. And on his return, he continued many of the habits that he had learnt on the Beagle voyage, one very significant element of which was to always make a record. And we now think that Darwin, of course, had been told to do this by the many people who helped him before he left on the voyage, but particularly took as his model the captain, who every day would necessarily be writing a logbook, would be writing his own journal, would be making very many calculations, would be spending much of his day not striding up and down the deck, issuing orders, but sitting in his cabin writing things down. And we know that Darwin spent a great deal of his time on the Beagle voyage, sitting down, writing things. We have a terrific archive of those materials in existence still today. And this image here is just a sample of some of the notebooks that he took out with him in the field on the Beagle voyage. And when he returned from the voyage, he continued this habit of always having a notebook with him in his pocket, so that the notebooks that we now know as, or we now give the name to, the transmutation notebooks, which were composed from 1837 through to 1844 or so, those years after the Beagle voyage, in which Darwin was exploring the idea of transmutation, those notebooks look exactly like these notebooks. And it's a continuation of the habit of always having paper and pencil with you so that you can write down your thoughts. So nowadays, one could almost say that after the Beagle voyage, Darwin's life, the rest of Darwin's life, was dedicated to exploring the questions that had arisen during that voyage. An intellectual voyage, after the physical voyage had finished, that took him onwards to The Origin of Species, published in 1859, and beyond to The Descent of Man and a number of other very significant works afterwards. And we can now see that the voyage turned him into a well-trained expert. It gave him self-discipline and the tools of his trade, not least this ability I've already mentioned of being able to make written records. It provided him with an opportunity to dwell on large, all-embracing metaphysical questions, while also being focused on recording the details. And if one was to characterize the scope of Darwin's Origin of Species, one of the reasons that it has lasted and lasted so amazingly well is that that book combines a tremendously all-embracing theories of the world and our place in the world with the fine detail that supports the case. The voyage also gave Darwin self-confidence and something that he didn't recognize, but we can now clearly see, a network of colleagues and contemporaries who were eager to welcome him when he arrived home, to welcome him back into the world of science. And lastly, and of course most famously, the reason why we're all here, the Beagle voyage opened up for Darwin the question of species. In his personal account, however, in his recollections of the development of my mind and character, there are no Galapagos finches, no eureka moment on the archipelago. Instead, he says that he began on the entirely Baconian system of collecting facts. after my return to England, it appeared to me that by following the example of Lyell in geology, and by collecting all facts which bore in any way on the variation of animals and plants under domestication and nature, some light might perhaps be thrown on the whole subject. And Darwin went on throughout the rest of his life believing that that was the way he had done it. He went on in his recollections to speak of the way that he worked assiduously for several months after his return before reading, for amusement, Malthus's essay on the principle of population, which gave him the idea of natural selection. So he first came to think of the idea of transmutation in his terminology, and had a number of theories that he thought might explain it. He was consciously working his way through possible methods to explain what he felt he could see in the natural world. Still possibly not a completely committed evolutionist, because he hadn't got a mechanism, or satisfactory mechanism, but when he read Malthus, he found such a mechanism, one that resonated with the ambiance of the early Victorian period, one that resonated with the world of the Industrial Revolution, the world of social progress and reform and advance, that he recognized in September 1838 that he really did have a theory by which to work. And what we now know, and can so clearly see in the archival record, is that Darwin did work on that theory. He spent decades afterwards following through every conceivable wrinkle that might occur to him, and the aim that was driving him through these long years was the thought that he had a fabulously informative, a revolutionary theory. He could see the impact it would have if he could only support it properly. And he wanted to delay and delay and delay until he had all the evidence that he felt was appropriate, that this theory needed in order to present it to the public in the best possible way. However, his account of how he did this is not the account that we now support. Many scholars have drawn attention to the mismatch between Darwin's reconstruction of how he came to do it and have shown how Darwin was in actuality responding to the culture of his own day. We can see that Darwin's representation of his own intellectual development isn't the same story that historians have come to agree on now. And there's been a very fine succession of articles and papers, many of them by members of this eminent audience here tonight. This succession of papers have described the actual course of Darwin's shift towards transmutationist thinking, the long time it took, the false starts, the anxieties, the hesitations, especially in view of the religious implications of his views, and the researches that he felt were necessary before anything like a preliminary statement could be made. And so with this brief overview in mind, I want to turn now to the different ways that this story of Darwin's development appears in the biographical literature. Now, it hardly needs saying that the early accounts in English rested almost entirely on Francis Darwin's Life and Letters and More Letters, published in 1887 and 1903, respectively. And I've just brought with you some very dull slides, and the dullness is part of what I wanted to say. These are the three frontispieces from the 3 volumes of Life and Letters that Francis Darwin produced. First, there was the image of Darwin round about the time that he published The Origin of Species. This is from a photograph. It's an engraving that was then reproduced in the Life and Letters. Another very more famous one in the 2nd volume of Life and Letters, Darwin again from a photograph, turned into a wood engraving in this case, and reproduced in the Life and Letters. And lastly, this very evocative one in a cape that his children gave him So he was often photographed in later life in this particular cape, but he's standing outside, he's very wistful. The prominent feature of the image is his eyes, and Darwin here does seem to represent visually much of what was coming to be thought about him in that year, 2 years, 5 years after his death, that he was a sage, that he was full of wisdom, that he could see further than other scientists. And the emphasis on the eyes is a very prominent part of these 3 images that come from the life and letters. And I show them, they're familiar, they're dull, but they remind us what a very restricted visual information the reading public must have had with Darwin at the end of the 19th century. Yet these volumes very quickly established the most authoritative record of Francis Darwin, and the images do become iconic for following generations. They show Darwin as a quiet, thoroughly respectable Victorian gentleman. And these volumes, produced by Francis, bring personal knowledge, quite extensive literary ability, and scientific understanding to the description of Charles Darwin's life and work. It included also the first printed version of Darwin's autobiography, these recollections of my mind and character, which made a great impact. And they were accompanied by a chapter of recollections by the family that show Darwin. They reveal something of the private Darwin for the first time. And I'm dwelling on this life and letters because it kind of creates the Darwin that we now still know. It's a very important text in this regard. Darwin was described by his children and by the many people who contributed to this volume through their letters and recollections as a loving father and friend, as a courteous correspondent, socially respectable, intellectually honest, and personally humble. As a man who had accumulated the mountain of evidence presented in The Origin of Species, who stood apart from controversy and nobly endured lifelong illness. And as Francis Darwin painted it, these fine, simple qualities were crucial in Darwin's intellectual success. And nowadays, we can understand this emphasis on the humility, the nobleness, the standing apart from controversy. We can acknowledge that these were part of Darwin's character, but we can also historicize those qualities and say that much of this emphasis on humility and honesty is the Victorian equivalent of a certain kind of credit-building process that's described by the sociologist of science Stephen Shapin in 17th century science. It was important for Victorians to believe that science was carried out by trustworthy, respectable men. And the way that Francis Darwin continued to present his father emphasized for readers that figures like Darwin did not seek to overthrow the church. They didn't seek to overthrow the political establishment, that science was being carried out independently by respectable people who were honest about what they were up to. Most of all, however, Francis Darwin portrayed his father as a hard worker. To showcase this mental labor was another very significant biographical move that took its impetus from the busy, productive, self-made man of Samuel Smiles's England. Earlier ideas of the uniquely inspired individual promoted by Thomas Carlyle, Ralph Waldo Emerson, or the romantic hero embodied by Humphrey Davy, or Goethe, or Keats, or Lord Byron, were almost completely supplanted in Britain in the last third of the century by Smiles's descriptions of honourable toil, a shift away from the terminology of romantic genius towards Victorian exertion. the Christian, and we could even take this further, we could say that the Christian topoi of saintly self-dedication and austerity were transferred to the idealized man of science, and great thinkers were rewritten as great workers. Now, a very different Darwin appeared in the aftermath of World War I. Hard work and virtue gave way to inner turmoil. As literary historians remind us, the 1920s and 30s saw authors, at least those authors writing in English, turn towards the interior life of men and women, answering a new social and psychoanalytic call to focus on human character. It was the day of the biographer, wrote Hesketh Pearson in 1930, a prolific biographer himself, whose first publication was a study of Dr. Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather. There was at the same time much theoretical consideration of life writing, taking its color from Lytton Strachey, from André Maurois, Emile Ludwig, Leslie Stephen, and Edmund Goss, appearing most obviously in Britain in the writings of Virginia Woolf, and Harold Nicholson, and more intriguingly in America in those of Gamaliel Bradford, who I hadn't come across until I started this research, but is a most interesting writer who advocated a new genre of psychography. And Bradford wrote an excellent short biography of Darwin in 1926. It's one of the first to ask very modern questions about what kind of man was this? Why was he so sick? How did he manage to stand aside from the religious world in which he was brought up? So Bradford and others were beginning to think about the inner life of Darwin that had not been explored in the same kind of way by Francis Darwin or by Darwin himself. Creativity began to feature as an issue too. Nora Barlow, who I think was a wonderful historian and contributed very materially to the creation of the Darwin record that we have today. Darwin's granddaughter, Horace Darwin's child, one of the new breed of scientific women living in Cambridge, actively researching Mendelian genetics with William Bateson in Cambridge. She began in the 1930s to explore the origins of Darwin's evolutionary ideas, seeking to understand his inspiration and motives. And though she didn't write a biography as such, she was highly innovative in bringing unpublished manuscripts, especially those from the Beagle Voyage and Darwin's recollections, to bear on his intellectual development. And in this regard, Bradford and Barlow both considered Darwin to be one of the secular moderns. To them, the fading of religious opinion through the 19th century was the key to the rise of 20th century science, and they were really the first to set about publicizing Darwin's loss of faith in order to promote the new dawn of secular humanist thought. And from Nora Barlow's time onwards, there was increasing use of archival sources to find the inner man, an innovation which was only made possible by the magnificent post-war bequest of Darwin papers from the family to Cambridge University Library, with the welcome support of the Pilgrim Trust. And I would like very much to acknowledge that extraordinary gift. Papers that include his correspondence, some 16,000 items, but also his library, which has been increased over the years from various resources, his notebooks, his private papers, his wife and children's papers, the photographic record. It's a magnificent, magnificent archive that I think should be acknowledged. And I believe we have some members of the Darwin family tonight, so I would like to publicly thank you for that. Yet Darwin's theoretical notebooks, the ones in which he first starts to think about evolutionary theory, the secret transmutation notebooks, hardly feature in any of these biographical accounts before the 1950s. Even though Francis Darwin published a few extracts, Nora Barlow published considerably more, in that pre-1959 period, they were evidently not regarded as quite the same talisman of creativity as they now are. I just want to make a small interlude here and to say that as part and parcel of this interwar biographical effort, Darwin's House and Garden at Down House in Kent were opened as a museum in 1929 and were recreated as his home. Certainly parts of it were redressed as his home, as a temple to his mind and personality as they were then perceived. And I'd like to suggest that this was just as much a biography in content and atmosphere as any text between two covers. And it was furnished with the help of two surviving family members who recreated the old rooms and gardens as they remembered them. And this is William Darwin and Henrietta Darwin taking a walk in the Down House gardens. So, as an expression of Darwin's personality, Down House in the 1930s and 40s, continuing on until very recent, until the 1990s when it was refurbished by English Heritage, taken as an expression of Darwin's personality, the house as it was originally presented portrayed British science at its most ingenious and domestic. The traditional gardens, the country setting, the old-fashioned furnishings, and here the image I'm showing you, Darwin's recreated study, show Darwin's science as essentially humane and far removed from the menace of big laboratories. The implication is that all Darwin needed to do his great work was peace and quiet and a pencil and paper. And Darwin's original study, where The Origin of Species was written, was encountered here as a quiet, homely place, very different from the fast-moving, high-powered research institutes becoming active elsewhere. And although maybe you can just see it, it's so domestic. All the pictures of his friends and relations over the mirror and the fireplace, it's so domestic. There's even a stuffed dog here in the basket, waiting, it's Polly, his little dog, waiting for him to finish the work and to go out for a walk. So the house, restored as a tribute to Darwin, implicitly declared that science was not a threat to social values. So when the 1959 celebrations of the origin of species came around, the ground was fertile not merely for biologists to promote the new evolutionary synthesis that was brought about by Ernst Mayr, Ledyard Stebbings, George Gaylord Simpson, and others in the 1940s. There was a big opportunity for these biologists to make a public statement about the unification of the biological sciences. It was also an opportunity for biologists to affirm their own ancestry, to make links back to Darwin that had not appeared to be necessary beforehand. There were a number of biographies published in that year, perhaps the year before, in 1959 and in 1960. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Gavin de Beer, director of the Natural History Museum in London, produced a biography in which he, this is quite a dramatic word, in which he cleansed Darwin, he purified Darwin, removed him from the social and moral contamination of social Darwinism. He stated that Darwin was not a social Darwinist, that he was virtuous and responsible, and that he did not draw anything from Malthus's political economy. And if he did, it was pretty quickly transformed into a biological theory that had no human implications for Darwin, that all the consequences of Darwinism, Darwin was not responsible for those. it's a moment in the development of views about Darwinism that De Beer was, at that point, actually unaware of quite a few significant manuscripts. But nevertheless, even when he was aware of those manuscripts, he continued to believe that Malthus had not been a very significant part of Darwin's achievement. Also, in 1959, the Galapagos finches first came into their own as an example of evolution by natural selection. David Lack's work, published in 1945 and then 1946 and 7, David Lack had gone to the Galapagos and worked very extensively with the finches and produced a book that was called Darwins Finches that became sufficiently well known for the terminology, Darwin's Finches, to become confused with the way that Darwin had developed his theory. So that from 1959 onwards, it was very commonplace to assume that Darwin had gone to the Galapagos and had a eureka moment there, that he had encountered diversification in the birds, that he had noticed the differentiation of the beaks, and that this was the tipping point for him. It's taken a long time for scholars, particularly the scholar Frank Sulloway, to uncrack that story, to dismantle that legend. But now it has been dismantled. The finches still have an important role in Darwin's thinking, but it's been shifted so that Darwin encountered that archipelago as a very strange and wonderful place. No question about that. It was a private Garden of Eden for him in many ways. It was a turning point in some sense, but that the real detail that pushed him over the edge into transmutationary thought came after the voyage returned. It came when Darwin's finches were identified by the very competent naturalist John Gould in London in March 1837, which gave Darwin information that did not match with his perceptions, which he had to sit down and resolve. And the resolution of that problem was that they must have changed. There must have been one ancestral finch that had, perhaps a couple of ancestral finches, that had spread out over the archipelago and that they had diverged in order to adapt to different conditions. And that is the point at which he became an evolutionist with no theory of natural selection, but he nevertheless became committed to evolutionary theory. One further element of the 1959 moment of biographical thought was that Darwin's personal integrity was continually emphasized at that point, particularly by discussing the probity, the honesty with which he responded to the letter from Alfred Russel Wallace that arrived in June, we think, June 1858. Here is an entirely imaginary representation of that moment, made in 1955 by the Russian biologist and artist Viktor Estafiev, and it was sent to the museum at Down House to commemorate the Russians' interest and appreciation of natural selection theory. It's part of a series of images that was sent. And we know it's fictitious for many reasons, but it includes Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker in the scene, presumably to serve as virtual witnesses to Darwin's gentlemanly behavior when confronted with Wallace's duplication of his own ideas. The biologist's Darwin therefore took shape in 1959 as a principled figure committed to maintaining the ethical standards and responsibilities of the scientific world, that Darwin was able to stand back from the knowledge that his views had been duplicated, that he insisted that Wallace's views should go forward, that his own work should stay in the background, until his two friends, Lyell and Hooker, said, we can work this out. Why don't we think about a joint publication, which was the eventual resolution. And this allowed Darwin and Wallace to present, or their work was presented jointly, but it allowed them in later life to have a very friendly relationship, that they were not competitors, that they were able to respect each other's work. And Darwin always afterwards felt anxious if Wallace had a different view from him, because here was the only other person who had had the same ideas as him. Wallace was very brilliant, and Darwin had a great deal of respect for his work. So that here we have a 1959 Darwin where all the issues of modern science were being explored by the people who were writing about him. Simultaneous discovery, priority issues, social Darwinism, the moral consequences of science, all these were being explored through the biographies that were being issued at the time. Now, today, we work very hard to reconstruct the world in which Darwin lived, the problems he tried to solve, and the resources upon which he drew for answers. And this has meant dismantling much of the story that I've been telling. Really, historians tend to spoil any party they go to. We try to break down everybody's convenient and much-loved legends. We try to break down the mytho-historical account of Darwin's hunt for a theory, and the traditional story that depicts Darwin as a solo worker who independently revolutionized the Victorian worldview. We've gone to a lot of trouble to suggest that the Darwinian revolution isn't really a revolution, and it's not completely Darwinian, or not totally due just to Darwin. So historians have worked hard to make a new Darwin out of the materials that we have, for the most part, in the library just across the way. And I wanted to conclude by saying, what do we now propose about Darwin's intellectual development? And the most striking thing is the new world opened up by the Darwin archive, in particular by Darwin's correspondence. It's one of the richest Victorian archives in existence, an extraordinary record of the way science got done in the 19th century. And this shows us Darwin working way beyond the initial formulation of a theory. We often talk about there being a big delay between Darwin first thinking of evolutionary theory and its publication some 20 years afterwards. We now know from looking at the archive that Darwin worked like hell through those 20 years, that he was working every day on a wide variety of issues in order to provide the support that he felt such an important theory deserved. It's not a delay, it's a record of the conscientious workings of a man who felt he needed to do his best for this extraordinary idea. And this new emphasis on archival sources has led to a full understanding of the legend of the Galapagos finches, as I've already mentioned, that these little birds were certainly the tipping point for Darwin, but this only came after the voyage, when John Gould identified the specimens as separate species, each confined to its own island. And the story of the finches, as described by Frank Soloway, his account of how Darwin didn't even think that they might be different on different islands, to the point that he collected them all up from one particular location, put them all in the same bag. He only wrote on the label that he attached to each foot, Galapagos. There was no sense in his mind that they came from different islands and that this might be of interest. It's only afterwards, sailing back to Britain with other information, including the fact that the tortoises are different on different islands, that he began to review that and say, if these facts are true, then they undermine the stability of species. So Frank Sulloway's work on this has been a classic instance that's applied now throughout the history of science as a detective story and as the unpicking of a legend. And that's what historians of science constantly try to do. The new emphasis on archives also indicates that Darwin's own remembrance of his university days was somewhat misleading. And I think since we're at Cambridge, and some of you will know that it's Burns Night coming up, so we could also remember Edinburgh University, that Edinburgh University and Cambridge University were agents of considerable instruction for Darwin, that he came out of those two places with an astonishing array of information, not much of it picked up in lecture, but nevertheless, he was deeply engaged with many of the professors. He read widely. He was out practicing natural history. He was talking to people. He was understood in Cambridge University as a very bright young man, sufficiently bright to be invited by John Stevens Henslow to evening parties, to talk with the great guns of the university. So he was learning all the time, and our archival record indicates not only that he was carefree and joyous and had a wonderful time, but that he was amazingly intelligent and very well trained for the work that he was eventually to do at Cambridge on the Beagle Voyage. And my last point, in fact, I've probably already run over it, is that the letters show us that Darwin worked very extensively from his return from the Beagle through the 1840s and 1850s in providing the evidence for his evolutionary views. In his home in Kent, he worked extensively on practical evidence, if he could, breeding pigeons, for example, as material evidence of the transmission of hereditary characters and the possibility that these domestic breeds, if they were hybridized over enough generations, would revert to some kind of ancestral type, that he might be able to find an example in the domestic world of what he thought had been happening in the natural world. He spent a very considerable number of years working on barnacles. We have Rebecca Stott here, who will recognize these illustrations, who has shown wonderfully how this barnacle work was a key part of the development of Darwin's theories through the 1850s. And my colleagues on the Darwin Correspondence Project, who are also here tonight, will recognize that one of the very significant parts of Darwin's middle life, the years that he spent working on the evidence for the origin of species, was conducted through correspondence, that the letters Darwin wrote to colleagues, some of whom he didn't know, but he had acquired an introduction to, his correspondence with his family and friends, all of which goes to show that he was methodically researching many, many different branches of natural history, the social sciences, and anthropology, all the issues that he was wanting to put forward as argument for the first book, The Origin of Species, and the later books, The Descent of Man, The Expression of the Emotions, Earthworms, Variation Under Domestication. These works were based on a research technique that we don't use now. It was based on correspondence. It was the email of Darwin's day. And he used it methodically, consistently, and abundantly. So this is certainly something that the archive shows us that has transformed the way we think about Darwin. And the last thing I would like to end on, very simple remark, but I think powerful and true and informative, that when Darwin was at Cambridge University, the life that he led here created him as an individual who so impressed his teachers that they could, when faced with a very attractive invitation to send someone on a round-the-world voyage. When faced with such an invitation, his professors could say, I'd like to go, and even think about it for a day or two, but then pass that invitation on to Darwin. They thought of Darwin. They immediately, after thinking about it themselves, they immediately thought Darwin was the person that would make good use of such a voyage. And they were not wrong. Those professors knew what they were doing. And they clearly couldn't have seen ahead to see quite what they were doing. But they understood that Darwin was just the person that Captain Fitzroy was seeking for. And so I'd like to end by saying that Cambridge University gave Darwin the future. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Thank you very much.
Well, as a historian, Professor Browne certainly hasn't spoilt our birthday party. I suppose, as with any great art or music or literature, it's a feature of great scientific theories that they're subject to fruitful reinterpretation as the generations pass. What Professor Browne has shown us as a biographer is that the work and the thinking of great scientists can do the same. She started with a ghost, and she certainly didn't exorcise the ghost. I think she's shown how we create successions of ghosts in the images of our time to some extent. And there's a much deeper point, which I think contributes to the richness of this lecture. By this sort of analysis of the development of someone's thinking and of how successive generations think about that thinking, it improves our understanding of how society understands both science and scientists, and that's of huge importance to the future. Thank you very much, Professor Starr.